What if the Eastern Front's most brutal battles weren't fought only by tanks and infantry, but by armored fortresses thundering down railway lines, machines that could level towns yet be destroyed by a single hidden charge? And what if these steel giants, once symbols of unstoppable power, ended their war trapped, burning, and abandoned on shattered tracks across Europe? The story of the Panzerzüge forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about how the war in the East was really fought. Armored trains on the Eastern Front emerged from a convergence of geopolitical, military, and logistical conditions that preceded the German-Soviet conflict of 1941-1945. Rail networks across Eastern Europe formed the backbone of strategic mobility for both Germany and the Soviet Union. In 1941, the Soviet Union maintained more than 106,000 kilometers of broad-gauge railways, while German planning relied on over 40,000 kilometers of standard-gauge track reaching eastward through occupied Poland. This environment made railway control a fundamental prerequisite for offensive and defensive operations. The armored train, heavy, rail-bound, and capable of delivering concentrated firepower, became a tool shaped by this infrastructure and the vast distances of the Eastern Front. Before the German invasion of the Soviet Union, both sides had already recognized the military value of armored trains. The Soviet Union entered the conflict with more than 50 operational trains distributed among NKVD security units, border defense forces, and Red Army formations. These trains varied widely. Some mounted 76mm guns or 122mm howitzers, while others carried lighter weapons intended for patrol and anti-partisan duties. Armored trains, though limited to fixed tracks, offered strong defensive capabilities and could support infantry by providing fire along predictable axes. For the Soviet Union, the early months of the war forced the mobilization of all available resources, including armored trains previously assigned to security forces. As German troops advanced, Soviet armored trains were tasked with delaying actions, evacuating civilians, and protecting railway hubs critical for troop and equipment transfers. Public sentiment and propaganda further influenced how both sides viewed armored trains. In the Soviet Union, they were depicted as symbols of industrial strength and resistance, emphasizing their role in evacuating factories and defending key cities during the first months of the war. German publications highlighted the adaptability of Panzerzüge, presenting them as tools that ensured security behind advancing panzer divisions. Germany entered the war with Panzerzüge that combined heavy armor, often exceeding 20-40mm thickness, with a variety of weapons including 105mm field guns, 20mm anti-aircraft cannon, and machine gun turrets. Some trains also carried detachable armored scout cars, enabling short-range reconnaissance beyond the railway. The Soviet Union fielded a broader diversity of designs, ranging from lightly armored patrol trains to heavily armed trains that integrated naval guns or railway-mounted tanks. However, initial Soviet preparedness was undermined by rapid territorial losses that forced relocation or destruction of many trains before they could be effectively organized. By June 1941, the Eastern Front had become the largest railway battlefield in history. The political stakes, industrial capacities, and geographic realities of the region made armored trains a distinct and necessary component of the conflict. Their development reflected the challenges of long-distance warfare, the dependency on rail logistics, and the need for mobile firepower in an environment where roads were often inadequate or destroyed. These preconditions formed the basis for the dramatic operational roles that Panzerzüge and Soviet armored trains would play during the early months of the invasion and throughout the shifting course of the war. The opening phase of armored train operations on the Eastern Front began with the launch of Operation Barbarossa on 22 June 1941. As German forces advanced along three major strategic axes toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev, Panzerzüge units were deployed to support breakthroughs, secure key railway junctions, and provide mobile fire support for infantry operating near rail corridors. Commanders of Soviet trains often coordinated directly with regional military headquarters to provide fire support during defensive battles along the Dnieper, western Dwina, and Berezina rivers. Initial movements during the opening phase were shaped by the rapidity of the German advance. German armored trains escorted troop transports and supply convoys deep into Soviet territory, providing reconnaissance by fire when approaching rail stations suspected of harboring Soviet defenders. The speed of German operations created logistical challenges. Trains frequently outran repair crews, forcing them to navigate partially restored rail lines. Panzerzüge commanders reported numerous instances of locomotives forced to slow to minimal speeds due to damaged tracks, making them vulnerable to artillery or small arms fire. Soviet armored trains played a different role. Many were deployed in last-ditch defensive actions as German spearheads approached major cities. For example, Soviet Train No. 16 supported defensive operations outside Mogilev by firing on German units advancing along the railway. Other trains participated in delaying actions around Smolensk and Kiev, providing cover for retreating Soviet divisions. These early engagements revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of armored trains. Their firepower could halt or slow advancing infantry, but their dependence on intact tracks allowed German artillery and engineers to neutralize them by destroying rail sections ahead of their movement. Reactions from both sides shaped subsequent operations. German commanders noted that Soviet armored trains often engaged aggressively, using their firepower to hold positions longer than expected. This forced German infantry to coordinate with engineers and artillery to disable tracks before trains arrived or to neutralize them with direct fire. In turn, Soviet commanders recognized the need to relocate trains frequently to avoid encirclement. Several trains were evacuated to eastern rail lines, where they provided fire support near Bryansk, Kursk, and Voronezh as the front shifted. Unexpected outcomes occurred during this phase. In some sectors, Soviet armored trains temporarily halted German advances by delivering concentrated fire on bridges or river crossings, delaying tank and infantry movement for several hours. German reports described instances in which artillery fire directed at Soviet trains was insufficient due to the train's reinforced armor. Conversely, some Soviet trains were destroyed when German engineers blew tracks under them, leaving immobilized wagons vulnerable to infantry assaults. Morale among personnel reflected the conditions of the opening phase. German train crews operated with confidence due to superior rail mobility in occupied areas and the lack of organized partisan resistance early in the campaign. German and Soviet strategic goals regarding the deployment of armored trains evolved rapidly during the first years of the Eastern Front. Both sides recognized that control of railways determined the tempo of operations, the stability of supply lines, and the security of vast occupied or contested territories. As a result, armored trains became integrated into broader operational doctrines, serving not only as mobile fire platforms, but also as tools of logistical protection, territorial control, and rapid reaction. Their use reflected a combination of strategic necessity, resource availability, and the lessons learned from earlier phases of the conflict. For Germany, the primary strategic objective was to secure and maintain long railway corridors extending hundreds of kilometers from the Reich into Soviet-controlled territories. These supply lines sustained entire army groups, Army Group North, Center, and South, each requiring thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food daily. The Soviets sought to prevent German forces from severing these evacuation efforts. Later, as the Red Army stabilized the front and shifted to counteroffensive operations, armored trains began serving as mobile artillery support for offensive thrusts along rail-accessible areas. Logistics were central to planning on both sides. German Panzerzüge required large quantities of ammunition, especially for their 75mm and 105mm guns. A typical armored train might carry several hundred high-explosive shells, thousands of machine gun rounds, and dozens of anti-aircraft magazines. Maintaining this stockpile demanded uninterrupted railway supply flow. Additional logistical pressure arose from the need to convert Soviet broad-gauge tracks to German standard gauge. Each mile of converted track had to be inspected and secured, placing significant dependency on armored trains to protect engineering detachments. Soviet armored trains also faced significant logistical challenges. Fuel shortages, damaged rail infrastructure, and the rapid reconfiguration of trains for different roles required flexible planning. Soviet commanders often reassigned trains to new tasks within hours, one day serving as an evacuation escort, the next providing indirect fire for local counterattacks. Soviet factories began producing standardized armored train designs by 1942, equipping new trains with T-34 turrets, 76mm guns, and welded armor plates that improved survivability. However, these upgrades increased the train's weight, making them dependent on stronger locomotives and intact tracks. Miscalculations played a significant role in shaping the use of armored trains. German planners overestimated the ability of Panzerzüge to operate deep inside Soviet territory without encountering large-scale partisan resistance. By 1942, partisan units with strength ranging from 50 to 400 fighters frequently targeted rail lines, planting explosives, ambushing patrols, and destroying bridges. Armored trains, while effective in repelling ambushes, often arrived too late to prevent sabotage. As a result, German commands were forced to allocate multiple trains to single sectors, straining resources. Another miscalculation involved underestimating Soviet armored train production capacity. Despite early losses, Soviet factories produced more than 20 new armored trains between 1942 and 1943, restoring frontline capabilities faster than German intelligence anticipated. Soviet planning also suffered from limitations. Heavy armored trains proved less effective in regions with damaged or partially repaired rail networks. In some cases, Soviet commanders deployed trains to sectors where mobility was severely restricted, resulting in immobilization due to track damage or mechanical failures. The decision to assign certain trains to prolonged defensive roles in cities such as Stalingrad reduced their operational lifespan due to continuous bombardment. Strategically, armored trains evolved from supporting roles into essential components of frontline operations. Germany increasingly relied on them to defend critical hubs such as Minsk, Gomel, Kiev, and later Warsaw as the war shifted westward. Soviet planners integrated trains more closely with combined arms offensives, using them to reinforce breakthroughs along railway axes that enabled rapid exploitation. By 1943-1944, both sides fully incorporated armored trains into their larger operational doctrines, recognizing their capabilities and limitations. In summary, the strategic goals and planning surrounding armored trains on the Eastern Front were deeply rooted in the realities of rail-dependent warfare. Both Germany and the Soviet Union viewed these trains as instruments for securing mobility, supporting large-scale operations, and compensating for weaknesses in other military branches. Their deployment reflected not only technological and logistical considerations, but also the strategic calculations and miscalculations that shaped the evolving course of the war. The first major clashes involving armored trains on the Eastern Front occurred during the summer and autumn of 1941, when both German and Soviet forces attempted to impose control over rapidly shifting front lines. These encounters were defined by mobility, uncertainty, and the unique challenges of rail-bound warfare. Early engagements demonstrated how armored trains could deliver concentrated firepower against advancing forces, yet also how quickly they became vulnerable once the surrounding situation changed. As the front expanded into Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic regions, armored trains encountered not only regular army units, but also civilians caught in contested rail zones and the first elements of emerging partisan movements. One of the earliest direct confrontations occurred near Orsha in late June 1941. As German mechanized units pushed eastward, Soviet armored trains No. 73 and No. 16 attempted to delay their advance by firing on German reconnaissance groups approaching key railway bridges. German infantry of the 7th Infantry Division responded with anti-tank guns and small arms fire, while engineers sought to destroy the tracks behind the Soviet trains. After firing more than 100 high-explosive shells, Soviet trains withdrew eastward due to the risk of encirclement. The clash produced limited military impact but highlighted the tempo of early engagements, brief, intense exchanges, followed by rapid withdrawals to avoid isolation. In Belarus, engagements around Vitebsk and Mogilev involved more sustained confrontations. Soviet armored trains supported defensive operations by targeting German armored columns advancing along railway-adjacent roads. Their artillery fire disrupted several German vehicle convoys and forced temporary halts. German Panzerzüge were slower in reaching the front due to rail conversion delays, but by July, trains such as Panzerzüge 26 began patrolling captured lines. These German trains conducted reconnaissance in force by advancing cautiously, firing into forests or suspected strongpoints, and withdrawing when encountering resistance. The cautious nature of these movements reflected lessons learned from earlier experiences. Advancing rapidly without reconnaissance risked ambushes or track demolition. Further south, around Kyiv and Poltava, armored trains played a crucial role during the Soviet attempts to stabilize defensive positions along the Dnieper. Soviet Train No. 8 provided fire support during the retreat from Kyiv by targeting German crossing attempts at several points along the river. Partisan fighters opened fire from concealed positions, forcing the crew to fight from within their armored wagons, while engineers attempted to repair the damaged rail section. Although the train escaped after several hours, the event marked the growing influence of irregular warfare on armored train operations. On the Soviet side, armored trains encountered German ambush tactics as the Wehrmacht adjusted to their presence. During a confrontation near Roslevel, a Soviet train approached what appeared to be an abandoned rail station. German infantry concealed in nearby buildings opened fire with anti-tank rifles and machine guns. The Soviet train responded with its 76mm gun, leveling several structures before reversing out of range. This interaction underscored the inherent difficulty of using trains in environments where visibility was limited and reconnaissance was insufficient. As the front line shifted eastward, territorial changes influenced the outcomes of these first engagements. German advances forced Soviet trains to operate in increasingly constrained rail pockets. Several Soviet armored trains were destroyed or abandoned when retreating units lacked time to evacuate rolling stock. For example, in the Smolensk sector, at least 2 Soviet armored trains were abandoned after German breakthroughs severed retreat routes. Conversely, German trains benefited from expanding rail networks, allowing them to operate more effectively in secured territories. Morale during these engagements varied sharply. German crews, supported by relatively secure rail lines and advancing fronts, initially maintained confidence in the train's utility. However, encounters with mines and partisan attacks introduced caution and concern. Soviet morale oscillated between determination during defensive operations and pressure from continuous retreats. Reports describe crews abandoning trains only after exhausting all ammunition or losing locomotives to artillery fire. Civilian populations experienced direct consequences of these engagements. Railway towns became battlegrounds, and residents were often caught between evacuating Soviet forces and advancing German units. Destruction of rail infrastructure left many civilians stranded. In some cases, towns dependent on railway employment faced immediate economic disruption as facilities were destroyed or repurposed for military use. By late 1941 and early 1942, the first engagements had revealed clear operational patterns. Armored trains performed effectively in open terrain with intact railways, providing strong fire support and enhancing local defensive capabilities. However, their vulnerability to encirclement, air attack, and rail sabotage became increasingly evident. These early confrontations laid the foundation for later phases of the conflict, where both sides adjusted their deployment strategies to account for lessons learned during the chaotic opening months of the war. As the war expanded into 1942 and early 1943, armored trains on both sides entered a period of escalation and crisis. The front lines stretched over thousands of kilometers, partisan warfare intensified, and the logistical strain on rail networks grew severe. These pressures transformed armored trains from secondary support assets into frontline necessities, but also exposed them to unprecedented levels of risk. The crisis phase was characterized by rising casualties among train crews, heavier engagements, increased dependence on rail transport, and escalating political demands from high command. Each of these pressures influenced how armored trains were deployed, maintained, and ultimately sacrificed in critical sectors of the Eastern Front. German armored trains faced growing challenges as partisan forces became more organized and better equipped. By mid-1942, partisan units in Belarus, Bryansk, and Smolensk had conducted more than 2,000 acts of railway sabotage in a single month. Mines capable of damaging locomotives or derailing wagons became common. In response, German commands increased the number of Panzerzüge assigned to security operations. For example, Army Group Center expanded its armored train patrols from approximately 8 trains in early 1942 to more than 15 by late that year, including both fully armored trains and lightly armored patrol wagons. Despite the increase, the vastness of controlled territory, over 600,000 square kilometers in 1942, made full coverage impossible. The crisis was worsened by weather and terrain. Spring thaws created flooding that weakened railbeds, forcing trains to reduce speed and making them vulnerable to ambushes. Winter conditions brought snow accumulation that blocked entire lines, requiring engineering battalions to clear sections manually. These seasonal obstacles slowed strategic mobility and increased crew fatigue. Reports from German train units detailed days spent stationary due to ice-damaged switches or frozen locomotives, during which they were exposed to artillery harassment or sabotage attempts. Soviet armored trains faced parallel difficulties, though for different operational reasons. Soviet counteroffensives, such as the winter operations of 1942-1943 around Rzhev, Stalingrad, and Voronezh, relied on maintaining supply lines through regions devastated by earlier fighting. Armored trains played a role in protecting these lines from German counterattacks. For instance, armored trains supported the movement of reinforcements toward Stalingrad by firing on German reconnaissance patrols that approached rail corridors south of Saratov. Although the armored wagons resisted small arms fire, even a near miss from a 50-kilo bomb could render a track impassable, immobilizing an entire train. Soviet trains encountered similar crises, particularly during offensives when they advanced close behind frontline units. During the summer of 1943, armored trains supporting the Belgorod-Kharkiv offensive frequently operated within 10 to 15 kilometers of German positions. This proximity allowed them to deliver immediate fire support, but also exposed them to counter-battery fire and aerial attacks. Several trains were lost when German artillery, directing fire from observation planes, successfully targeted exposed rail sections. One Soviet report from August 1943 described a train immobilized near Tomarovka, where German fire destroyed its locomotive and forced the crew to abandon the wagons. Command challenges also influenced the crisis phase. German officers increasingly complained that armored trains were being overused for missions better suited to infantry or motorized units. This overstretching resulted in higher casualties and equipment losses. Some trains were ordered to operate in sectors with insufficient reconnaissance, resulting in derailments or ambushes. Soviet command faced parallel issues. Political officers often pressured train commanders to hold positions longer than tactically advisable, leading to losses when trains were trapped or surrounded by German counterattacks. Morale among armored train crews fluctuated dramatically during this period. German crews experienced rising anxiety due to constant mine threats and the unpredictability of partisan attacks. Some units began carrying additional infantry detachments to reinforce their defenses, reducing available space for ammunition or supplies. Soviet morale, meanwhile, often improved during periods of successful counteroffensives, but crews remained aware of the high casualty risk. Several Soviet accounts emphasized the psychological strain of operating under conditions where a single track explosion could destroy an entire section of a train. The civilian population suffered heavily as rail lines became militarized zones. In areas such as Belarus and occupied Ukraine, Villages near railways were subject to reprisals following sabotage incidents. German countermeasures included forced labor brigades assigned to repair tracks under guard, creating dangerous conditions for civilians. On the Soviet side, civilians living near active rail corridors faced bombardment from both sides and were often caught between evacuations and advancing armies. By late 1942 and early 1943, the escalation and crisis phase had reshaped the role of armored trains. However, Soviet air sorties increased substantially during the battle. Armored trains remained vulnerable despite their thick plates, as even near misses damaged track sections, forcing frequent withdrawals for repairs. Soviet armored trains reached comparable intensity during this period. Bronepose No. 30 supported the Soviet counteroffensive following the Kursk defensive victory. Operating along the Kursk-Belgorod Railway, it provided direct fire for advancing rifle divisions and suppressed German strongpoints located near railway stations. In one instance, the train fired more than 150 rounds of 76 mm ammunition during a single breakthrough operation. However, advancing too close to the front lines exposed it to German artillery. On 10 August 1943, the train sustained significant damage from counter-battery fire, forcing a withdrawal for repairs lasting several days. This pattern became common. Soviet trains delivered intense fire support, then retreated to secondary lines whenever German countermeasures became overwhelming. High command decisions on both sides increasingly reflected the need to balance the importance of armored trains with their vulnerability. German commanders frequently rotated Panzerzüge between sectors to prevent overexposure. For example, Panzerzüge 26 operated across more than 300 kilometers of track between April and September 1943, moving between Bryansk, Roslavl, and Smolensk. Such mobility allowed the train to reinforce sectors under sudden threat, but also accelerated mechanical wear, requiring constant locomotive maintenance. German railway engineers struggled to maintain locomotives damaged by shrapnel, rail stress, or sabotage. Spare wheels, boiler tubes, and armored plate reinforcements became increasingly scarce due to Allied bombing of German industry. Soviet command also faced resource limitations. Despite producing new trains equipped with T-34 turrets and improved armor, Soviet armored train brigades suffered from shortages of high-quality locomotives. Many were built from older pre-war models, refitted for combat, limiting acceleration and maneuvering speed. High command orders often required trains to remain close to major supply stations, where fuel and ammunition were more accessible. This restricted operational range but allowed for rapid deployment when breakthroughs occurred, such as during the Belgorod-Kharkiv offensive in August 1943 or the Smolensk operation in September. Civilian suffering intensified during this phase as rail hubs became central battlegrounds. Cities such as Orel, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk saw heavy fighting around railway yards where armored trains operated. Soviet civilians hiding near rail lines risked bombardment from both sides as tracks became target zones. German occupation authorities, struggling to maintain control amid increasing partisan activity, often used local labor to repair damaged lines. Civilians were forced to work under guard, and many were exposed to artillery strikes, sabotage explosions, or crossfire between armored trains and partisan units. The largest-scale operations involving armored trains occurred during the battles for major river crossings. In the summer and autumn of 1943, as German forces retreated toward the Dnieper, armored trains supported rearguard actions. Panzerzüge 7 and Panzerzüge 8 covered withdrawals across the Vorskla and Dnieper rivers by firing on Soviet units advancing along the rails. At the same time, Soviet armored trains assisted Red Army crossings by striking German reserves gathered near railway embankments. The peak of these engagements occurred in late September, when multiple trains from both sides exchanged artillery fire near Poltava. Soviet air forces eventually forced the German trains to retreat, demonstrating the increasing dominance of aircraft in determining the outcome of clashes involving rail-bound units. Losses increased as the campaigns intensified. German records indicate that between January and December 1943, at least 7 Panzerzüge were destroyed or abandoned due to battle damage or encirclement. Soviet records list comparable losses. with more than 10 armored trains disabled or scrapped during the same period. Many were lost not in direct combat, but due to rail demolitions executed during retreats, preventing trains from escaping advancing forces. The peak phase also saw the innovation of mixed armored groups. German units sometimes combined Panzerzüge with armored scout cars and infantry companies, creating mobile battle groups capable of responding to threats near the rails. Soviet forces experimented with integrating armored trains into tank-supported spearheads, allowing trains to hold captured rail stations while tanks advanced further into contested territory. By early 1944, the intensity of armored train operations reflected the strategic desperation on both sides. Germany relied heavily on armored trains to secure shrinking rail networks behind collapsing fronts, while the Soviet Union used them to reinforce offensives stretching across hundreds of kilometers. The combination of heavy combat, increasing air superiority for the Soviets, and growing partisan activity made this period the most demanding and most destructive in the entire history of Eastern Front armored train warfare. As the Eastern Front continued to shift in 1944, armored trains entered a prolonged phase defined by resistance, adaptation, and an increasingly desperate need for tactical improvisation. This period saw both German and Soviet train crews confronting deteriorating rail conditions, intensifying partisan warfare, and expanding frontline instability. For both sides, the challenge was no longer only delivering firepower, but preserving operational capability under conditions that severely limited mobility and increased the likelihood of entrapment. The result was a series of actions in which armored trains were forced to evolve in their functions, tactics, and coordination methods while fighting to maintain relevance in a rapidly changing war. German armored trains found themselves at the center of defensive operations as Army Group South and Army Group Center withdrew westward in early 1944. Rather than supporting offensives, Panzerzüge became mobile strongpoints deployed to cover retreat routes, delay Soviet advances, and protect critical junctions where multiple rail lines converged. These trains frequently fought as part of improvised defensive clusters, combining their artillery with infantry from security divisions and engineers assigned to repair damaged tracks. For example, Panzerzüge 10, operating near Shepetivka, conducted repeated fire missions to suppress Soviet probes aimed at cutting withdrawal lines. In these engagements, the train functioned as a stationary battery almost as often as a mobile one, firing from protected locations behind embankments to reduce exposure to artillery and airstrikes. Soviet armored trains also adapted to new operational requirements. During the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive and subsequent thrusts toward western Ukraine, Bronepojezda units transitioned from their earlier roles of direct fire support into more flexible forms of battlefield integration. Some Soviet trains began transporting assault detachments directly into contested stations, offloading infantry under covering fire to secure key points ahead of advancing rifle divisions. This combination of mobility and fire support accelerated breakthroughs along rail corridors. For example, Bronepojezd No. 7 played a notable role in securing a foothold near Vinnytsia by supporting the capture of a rail junction after German defenders attempted to sever the line with controlled demolitions. Partisan warfare continued to evolve, forcing both sides to adapt their armored train tactics. German Panzerzüge increasingly faced ambushes where partisans employed more sophisticated methods involving multiple explosive charges, interlocking fields of fire, and decoy attacks. Concealed groups detonated mines after the locomotive passed, but before the armored wagons moved through, trapping the train between damaged rail segments. Innovation extended beyond engineering solutions. German armored trains began incorporating elements of camouflage doctrine, using smoke generators and painted panels to conceal their shape from Soviet aircraft. Some crews laid out deception tracks using wooden beams to create the illusion of alternate routes. These measures occasionally succeeded in diverting attacks, although their effectiveness diminished as Soviet air reconnaissance improved. Meanwhile, Soviet armored trains received additional anti-aircraft weaponry, including multiple 12.7mm DSHK machine guns and, in a few cases, 37mm automatic cannons mounted on flat cars. These additions provided some measure of protection against German ground attack aircraft, which increasingly targeted rail hubs. The psychological toll on train crews intensified as both sides confronted the growing sense that armored trains, once symbols of mobility and power, were becoming increasingly vulnerable. German crews faced the constant threat of encirclement. Reports from early 1944 describe multiple instances where trains were abandoned because retreat routes had been severed by Soviet breakthroughs. Crews sometimes destroyed locomotives with explosive charges to prevent capture before retreating on foot. Morale declined as the strategic situation deteriorated and the sense of isolation increased. Soviet crews, despite operating in an army advancing across Ukraine, experienced their own stresses. Operating armored trains near active fronts required vigilance, as a single artillery shell landing on exposed track could immobilize the train within minutes. Crew fatigue grew as trains were frequently ordered to operate day and night, providing fire support for advancing units and transporting ammunition or reinforcements. Many Soviet crews served continuously for weeks, with limited rest due to the demands of maintaining offensive momentum. Civilian populations continued to endure the consequences of armored train activity. Rail junction towns remained focal points of destruction, as both sides used artillery and demolition charges to control or deny key infrastructure. Civilians living near rail lines often faced forced evacuations as fighting approached. In occupied regions, German authorities expanded forced labor programs to repair sabotaged tracks, exposing workers to significant danger. In Soviet-liberated areas, civilians supported reconstruction, but faced shortages of food and shelter due to the destruction of rail-based supply systems. As the front lines moved west, armored trains were forced to adapt to shrinking mobility corridors. German forces attempted to consolidate their rail network in western Ukraine and Belarus, but as territory was lost, Panzerzüge found fewer secure lines available. What had once been an essential asset for both sides, capable of providing heavy fire support, securing vast rail networks, and reinforcing defensive lines, was now increasingly unable to cope with the pace, scale, and direction of the war. The combination of Soviet breakthroughs, German territorial collapse, and the near-total loss of air and logistical superiority created a situation in which armored trains could no longer fulfill their intended operational roles. Their function shifted from active combat deployment to delaying actions, last-stand defenses, and ultimately attempts to escape encirclement before rail lines were cut. Operation Bagration, launched on 22 June 1944, marked the beginning of this irreversible shift. As Soviet armies broke through German Army Group Center's defensive lines across Belarus, they rapidly advanced along multiple axes, cutting railway routes before German units could reposition. German Panzerzüge stationed in Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and Baranovichi were suddenly confronted with the collapse of the rail network that sustained their mobility. At least 3 armored trains, including Panzerzug 31 and Panzerzug 72, were trapped when Soviet spearheads reached key junctions ahead of retreating German forces. One German train abandoned near Minsk was destroyed by its crew after demolitions teams determined that surrounding track segments were already under Soviet control. Another attempted a breakout westward, but encountered Soviet tanks at a demolished bridge and was annihilated after firing more than 180 shells in a final defensive action. The Soviet advance revealed the fundamental vulnerability of armored trains, their reliance on intact, continuous rail infrastructure. Soviet mechanized corps, capable of advancing 30 to 50 kilometers per day, frequently outpaced the ability of German engineers to repair damaged lines. As a result, Panzerzüge found themselves restricted to shrinking islands of operable track. German railway commands issued urgent orders to evacuate armored trains westward, but many could not move due to fuel shortages, destroyed bridges, or Soviet air attacks that targeted locomotives attempting to reposition. The Luftwaffe's weakened condition, often reduced to fewer than a dozen operational fighters in major sectors, left trains fully exposed to Soviet Il-2 ground attack sorties. Soviet armored trains experienced a different turning point. Whereas German trains faced increasing entrapment, Soviet Bronepojezda found their operational value diminishing as their own army's mobility increased. In earlier stages of the war, rail corridors defined front lines and retreat paths. But by mid-1944, Soviet armored and mechanized formations advanced rapidly across regions where rail lines had been destroyed by German demolitions or rendered unusable by weeks of shelling and airstrikes. Armored trains struggled to keep pace with mobile front lines. They increasingly arrived only after battles had concluded, serving more as stabilizing forces in liberated urban areas than as frontline weapons. Their artillery capability remained useful for suppressing isolated German pockets, but their strategic role steadily eroded. A critical turning point occurred in western Ukraine and southeastern Poland, where Soviet advances severed German railway lifelines running from Lviv and the Carpathian foothills toward central Poland. German Panzerzüge deployed near Lviv and Tarnopol attempted to hold open evacuation routes for encircled or retreating units. One German armored train operating near Tarnopol reportedly fired more than 250 rounds in 2 days to support the withdrawal of infantry before its rail line was cut by Soviet forces moving from the north. With no alternative route, the crew evacuated on foot after detonating the locomotive to prevent capture. The psychological impact on German train crews intensified during this period. Reports noted a growing awareness that armored trains were becoming static targets rather than maneuvering assets. Crews faced the constant threat of being overrun. In several cases, armored trains were forced to fight as fixed artillery positions, their locomotives disabled by track demolitions or airstrikes. German commanders frequently ordered trains to hold junctions until the last shell, as retreating units depended on every additional hour gained. Such orders reflected the strategic necessity, but also contributed to high crew casualties and equipment losses. On the Soviet side, train crews experienced a different form of pressure. The need to maintain operational readiness while moving through obliterated railway regions. Engineering brigades often required days to repair a few kilometers of track, slowing the deployment of armored trains to newly liberated areas. The result was an increasing reliance on motorized artillery and tanks for frontline fire support, reducing the direct combat role of armored trains. Soviet commanders nonetheless valued trains for securing logistical hubs, guarding bridges, and providing rapid stabilizing fire along threatened segments of newly reopened rail routes. Civilians witnessed the turning point through the destruction of railway infrastructure. Bridges blew up during German retreats, rail yards burned under Soviet bombardment, and entire towns built around railway stations became ruins. Civilians in areas such as Minsk, Brest, Lviv, and Lutsk observed armored trains firing from behind damaged embankments, only to be abandoned or destroyed days later as front lines shifted past them. Rail corridors once central to daily life became battle zones marked by wrecked wagons, derailed locomotives, and burned-out armored cars. By late 1944, the turning point was complete. The armored train, once a formidable tool of firepower and mobility, could no longer influence the course of the war. German Panzerzüge were increasingly isolated, destroyed, or rendered immobile. Soviet trains continued to operate, but no longer shaped major strategic outcomes. The war had moved into a phase characterized by sweeping advances, mechanized operations, and air dominance, conditions in which the relevance of armored trains declined sharply. The events of 1944 demonstrated conclusively that armored trains had reached the limit of their effectiveness. Their dependency on fixed tracks could no longer keep pace with the fluid, high-speed operations that now defined the Eastern Front. The turning point marked the beginning of their final decline, setting the stage for the last, desperate uses of these armored giants in the closing months of the war. Panzerzüge 68 and Panzerzüge 72 were deployed along the Insterburg-Königsberg line, firing repeatedly at Soviet infantry and tank units, attempting to cut the final evacuation corridor toward the city. These trains, operating in freezing temperatures and amid widespread infrastructure collapse, defended a series of small towns by firing from behind snow-covered embankments. Their locomotives were frequently repositioned to prevent immobilization by Soviet artillery, but the speed of the Soviet advance rendered such measures increasingly ineffective. Several clashes ended when Soviet units bypassed the rail line entirely, threatening the armored trains with encirclement. Crews detonated their wagons after exhausting ammunition, withdrawing on foot toward Königsberg. In Silesia and the Vistula region, the aftermath of retreats and broken supply chains forced German armored trains into even more improvised roles. Panzerzüge 4, positioned near Oppeln, attempted to cover the withdrawal of infantry divisions retreating toward Breslau. During one engagement, the train fired more than 220 shells against Soviet forward detachments before Soviet artillery destroyed a section of track behind it, trapping the train in place. Engineers attempted emergency repairs under fire, but Soviet forces closed in within hours. The crew abandoned the train, destroying its locomotive before retreating across agricultural fields. Similar outcomes occurred across Lower Silesia, where armored trains were left stranded due to destroyed bridges, fuel shortages, or Soviet artillery interdiction. Soviet armored trains also entered a new phase in the aftermath of major breakthroughs. While they were no longer frontline assault assets, they played key roles in securing liberated regions, transporting wounded soldiers, escorting supplies, and stabilizing rail infrastructure in areas ravaged by destruction. In Poland and eastern Germany, Soviet trains helped suppress remaining pockets of resistance and guarded rail lines used to bring in engineering brigades. For example, a Soviet armored train deployed near Poznan supported infantry during the encirclement of the fortress city by firing on German artillery positions located near key rail junctions. After the city fell, the train remained in the region to deter German demolition teams attempting to disrupt Soviet supply routes. The humanitarian consequences of the war became vividly visible along the rail corridors where armored trains once fought. German civilians fleeing westward in early 1945, estimated in the hundreds of thousands, crowded rail stations under the protection of retreating Panzerzüge. In East Prussia, long lines of refugees waited in freezing conditions as armored trains exchanged fire with Soviet units closing in from the east. Several trains were assigned to escort evacuation transports, but shortages of fuel, damaged rails, and Soviet air superiority frequently halted these efforts. At least 2 evacuation trains in Pomerania were overtaken by Soviet mechanized forces, forcing German crews to abandon both armored wagons and civilian coaches. In newly liberated Soviet and Polish territories, civilians encountered the aftermath of prolonged combat along the rails. Derailed armored wagons, burned-out locomotives, and destroyed stations. Many rail workers were tasked with clearing debris while navigating minefields and unexploded ordnance left behind. Soviet reconstruction units instituted rapid repair programs, sometimes restoring limited traffic within 24 to 48 hours to critical junctions. Despite these efforts, the destruction of thousands of kilometers of track and hundreds of bridges meant that full railway capacity could not be restored until long after the war. The surrender phase for armored trains began in April and early May 1945. German units retreating into Bohemia and Moravia attempted to preserve surviving Panzerzüge as mobile defensive assets. One armored train near Olomouc fired on Soviet reconnaissance groups before being surrounded and captured intact by elements of the First Ukrainian Front. Another German train surrendered near Pardubice after negotiations between officers and Soviet commanders. Many trains in Austria, including those stationed near Vienna, were abandoned as German forces withdrew into the Alps. Soviet forces documented several armored trains left at sidings with their ammunition expended and locomotives rendered inoperable by demolition charges. Soviet armored trains, by contrast, continued operating through the final days of the war, but saw little direct combat. Instead, they served administrative and security roles during the occupation of cities such as Berlin, Dresden, and Prague. After hostilities ceased, many were reassigned to border security duties or used in clearing operations to remove wreckage from the thousands of kilometers of rail lines disrupted during the war. The immediate consequences of this final phase were stark. The Eastern Front's rail system, once among the largest in the world, had been devastated. Entire regions were left without functioning transportation networks. For civilians, the end of armored train combat brought relief from bombardment, but not from displacement, hunger, or infrastructural collapse. For military planners, the final months demonstrated conclusively that armored trains, despite their resilience and tactical value, were no longer suited for modern mobile warfare dominated by tanks, trucks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry. By the time Germany surrendered on 8 May 1945, the armored trains that had once defined key sectors of the Eastern Front were largely gone, destroyed, abandoned, or repurposed. Or their final actions, measured in last bursts of artillery fire or rushed evacuations under collapsing front lines, symbolized the end of an era in which rail-bound firepower had shaped the movement of armies across vast territories. The aftermath reflected both the destructive scale of the conflict and the rapid evolution of warfare that left armored trains behind as remnants of an earlier military age. The legacy of armored trains on the Eastern Front is defined by their dual identity as both powerful instruments of war and relics of a rapidly changing military era. Their impacts stretch beyond the tactical details of individual battles and into broader questions of military doctrine, technological adaptation, civilian experience, and the memory of a conflict fought across one of the most rail-dependent regions in modern history. As the war concluded in 1945 and the reconstruction of Eastern Europe began, the armored trains that once roared across thousands of kilometers of track entered a new phase of existence, some preserved, some scrapped, and many remembered only through scattered reports, photographs, and the ruins of armored wagons left on forgotten sidings. Militarily, the Eastern Front demonstrated the unique niche that armored trains occupied in early and mid-century warfare. Their ability to combine artillery, armored protection, and mobility along established rail corridors made them effective tools for securing large territories, supporting infantry, and reinforcing threatened sectors. Between 1941 and 1943, both German and Soviet armored trains played key roles in delaying offensives, escorting supply columns, countering partisan activity, and stabilizing crumbling fronts. Several Soviet armored trains were preserved as monuments in cities such as Volgograd, Bryansk, and Odessa, reflecting their enduring role in the national narrative of resistance and liberation. From a civilian perspective, the legacy of armored trains is tied to the profound human and infrastructural impact of the war along Europe's rail corridors. Many communities experienced firsthand the destruction caused by artillery duels between trains and ground forces. Railway workers, often operating under extreme danger, became crucial figures in repairing damaged tracks, rerouting traffic, and ensuring the movement of supplies and evacuees. After the war, the extensive damage to tracks, bridges, and stations required years of reconstruction, shaping local economies and labor demands. In some regions, abandoned armored wagons remained on sidings for years, becoming improvised shelters, storage spaces, or scrap metal sources for rebuilding efforts. Their story remains a testament to the complex interplay of technology, geography, and strategy that defined one of the largest and most devastating military campaigns in history.